Against My Will, Commemorating an Unlikely World War II Hero by Sandra Arthur. Many people have effectively used this quote in speeches and writings. One such paraphrase is, "We can learn from history, but we can also deceive ourselves when we selectively take evidence from the past to justify what we have already made up our minds to do." I think this is particularly poignant for today's history. The story I will share with you during this presentation features a young boy who was only 11 years old at the beginning of World War II. I'd like you to consider the points on this slide. I believe your generation, as well as myself, have never faced war, bombs, food shortages, separation, imprisonment, or death. Hopefully, food for thought as you learn about this unlikely hero. There are, of course, millions of stories about World War II, as you will all have possibly read novels or history books and seen movies about the amazing courage displayed by soldiers, doctors, nurses, and secret agents, and many more. These people were killed, wounded, and all made tremendous sacrifices serving their country. We owe them a great debt of gratitude. Believe it or not, World War II stories are still being shared and published today. I suspect your grandparents or family members may have a story to tell, but now I would like to share one of the stories from my family. This was Artur Zylinski. He was born in Lithuania to Polish and Lithuanian parents. Perhaps he would not be considered a traditional hero. However, during World War II, he was courageous, brave, and faced amazing conflict, trauma, and sadness. Nevertheless, he was also a survivor and achieved success after the war, despite being separated from his family at such a young age. His early life has remained mostly a secret, as confirmed by messages received from past colleagues, students, and even other family members. Artur Zylinski was my father-in-law. I never met him and yet was fascinated by his past history. I decided to write a book as the plight of ethnically Polish families living in Lithuania during World War II has rarely been reported or shared. After his wife's death, we found a hidden diary which revealed part of his wartime challenges. I was also lucky to speak with Polish relatives that knew Artur during the war and was able to provide information on the family history. The book has been written as a fast-paced historical fiction novel that follows not only the path of Artur, but also his mother and family. After I published the book, I heard from a retired journalist in the United Kingdom who told me her father had been one of the people who had escaped with Artur and they became lifelong friends. This journalist was able to provide more factual content as her father was older than Artur and had shared details of their life together. All this information has now been included as an addendum to my book. So whilst Artur's story is not unique, his fate was similar to many Eastern European boys and men, but their stories have not been shared. I hope by making this presentation today, I can pay tribute to them. Lithuania faced many changes during World War II. In 1939, Hitler and Stalin secretly divided Eastern Europe between them. Lithuania was allotted to Stalin and was absorbed into the USSR in 1940 after a sham election. The Soviets nationalized farms and businesses. They removed food to Russia and deported intelligentsia, people like teachers, police, religious priests, and so forth. They were sent to Siberia or they were executed. Those who were deported were transported to Russia by train, often in cattle cars with no amenities. The journey lasted many days. The conditions were unsanitary, passengers often lacked food and water, and many people died. In 1941, the Nazis invaded Lithuania and at first were wildly welcomed as liberators from the Soviets. The Lithuanians had hoped for re-establishing independence or regaining some autonomy, but sadly that was not the case. 250,000 Jews had lived in Lithuania, and the genocide rate of Jews in Lithuania during the war was 95 to 97%, the highest in Europe. Archie's father was a tailor in Kaunas and ran a workshop to produce clothing. He had 3 brothers. Sadly, his eldest brother, who had signed up with the Lithuanian army, was killed early in the war. Due to major food shortages, the Russians had sent Lithuanian foods and goods to Russia, as did the Germans to their country. His mother struggled to feed her family. As a result, Artur was sent to live with his grandmother shortly after war was declared. The Nazis visited schools and conscripted boys to join them. On one occasion, Archie's brothers had escaped out of a school toilet window and then spent their time hunting for food in the local woods to help feed the family, whilst avoiding being captured. At the age of 14, Artur was informed that Polish boys could no longer attend school. In late 1943, propaganda posters were pasted around in Lithuania, such as the one on the slide here, which says, "The German soldier is fighting for you. Work for him." Male students born between 1926 to 1929, so that's those aged between 13 and 16 years of age, were approached again at schools and on the street. Artur was given the choice: sign up to join the Wehrmacht or agree to go to a labor camp. If not, he and his family would face death. It wasn't much of a choice, so he opted to join and save his family. Artur bid goodbye to his family in 1943, not knowing when he would ever see them again. He was transported by either train or truck to Berlin and was secretly hoping to return within 1 year, hoping the war would be over. At first, he was sent to Berlin for training and work selection. Discipline was brutal, with regular executions of those that disobeyed. Some boys were sent to work with the German Air Force as anti-aircraft assistants. Some were sent to the Eastern Front to fight, others sent to northern France to build the Atlantic Wall, and unlucky boys were sent to labour camps. Artur completed his training and, perhaps unusually, was sent to Paris as a truck delivery driver at only 14 years old. He was part of the Legionnaires-Speer-Reich, which was a German-French legion. Due to Hitler's instructions to get more troops along the coastline in France, in early June 1944, he was sent to Brittany with a group of young men aged 16 to 18 years. The group were mainly conscripts or volunteers from the Soviet Union and other eastern territories occupied by Germany. He was given a gun and placed on guard duty to safeguard the German U-boats in a place called Quimperle. Here he endured shelling and bombing from low-flying British aircraft as well as American bombers. You'll recall the food shortages he and many people faced in Lithuania. Arthur felt, at least working for the Germans, he would be fed. However, even the Germans were struggling to feed their troops from the end of 1943, and rations were rather meagre. Shortly after the 1944 D-Day invasion, Security was slightly reduced, and Archer and two friends knew this could be their chance to flee. However, the German army were hidden around the many farms and small villages as the American Operation Cobra push in Normandy was penetrating south towards southern towns in Normandy and eventually west into Brittany. He encouraged his terrified two friends to escape with him. It was risky due to the number of Germans on guard around the surrounding landscape, and because, if caught, they would have all been shot. However, they decided to try their luck and jump off the back of one of the trucks on the way back to camp. They hid in nearby fields and farms, and then they were shot at by a French farmer. They had learnt sufficient French to explain that they were Polish and not German and asked for help. Luckily for them, the farmer agreed to introduce them to members of the French resistance. For the next month, the lads experienced a nerve-wracking period as they hid in ditches, haystacks, outbuildings, and were also passed from safe house to safe house in Brittany, but finally ending up in Normandy. Here they enjoyed their first glass of alcohol, an apple drink called Calvados, while hidden in a barn. The map on the slide highlights the locations from where they escaped in Quimperle to Avranches, which is a town near Mont-Saint-Michel, which is approximately a 250-kilometre journey. I recommend you check out Operation Cobra on YouTube, where you will find some terrifying scenes of bombings and attacks that took place during the war. The deafening noise from the guns and the bombs alone are quite frightening and will give you an idea of the environment that the lads were surrounded by as they were escaping. The French resistance told the young men their only chance to get to the UK and join the Polish forces was to be surrendered as a prisoner of war. Though not ideal, Arthur was conflict-ridden and anxious, but he urged his friends to surrender and hope for the best. As a result, they took their chances, and in late July 1944, they ventured into the dangerous area around Avranches, where they met two more German deserters who were Polish. They were now a group of 5 young men, and they were confronted by young American soldiers who mercifully did not kill them but began to beat them up. The young men were screaming in Polish, and thankfully one of the American soldiers who had Polish heritage could understand Polish and managed to stop the fighting and rescue them. They were now arrested as prisoner of war and awaited transport to the UK in August 1944. These young men, the group of 5, aged between 14 and 20 years old, were taken to the prisoner of war camp called La Marchand in Wiltshire. They had to be careful not to reveal they were Polish or complain too much, otherwise they could have been killed by the other German prisoners on suspicion of being spies. They were all graded according to their Nazi leanings or anti-Nazi viewpoints. Those with low risk were required to work on local farms. It was here that the only German prisoner of war escape took place in the UK. After 1 month in the prisoner of war camp, once background checks were made, Archer was sent to a displaced persons camp in London, where he spent 2 miserable months in a damp tent with other refugees. At night he could hear the German V-1 rockets buzzing overhead before exploding over London. He joked at the end of the war he had been bombed by all sides. What could he do now? He did not want to spend the rest of the war locked up in this camp. Archer discovered that 16-year-old men could request to join the Polish forces, which he promptly did. His request was accepted and he was sent to Scotland to join the 1st Corps, where he assisted with coastal defence duties. He was delighted to be reunited with older friends that had been immediately transferred from the prisoner of war camp. At last he felt he was contributing to the war effort in a positive way. In fact, you might be surprised to learn that 89,000 Polish men in the Polish forces had originally been conscripted in some way to fight for the German army. War ended and everybody was happy that the war was over. Or were they? Whilst the Poles constituted the fourth largest of the Allies, they did not take part in the end-of-war victory parade in 1946. Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin had divided Europe up for themselves, using Polish soldiers as pawns. They had fought hard for their homeland only to lose out. After 60 years, on the 10th of July 2005, the Poles were finally invited to lead the parade. And sadly, this was too late for most of the men involved in the war who had by then died. So back to the end of the war. 3 decisions faced the young Polish men. 1. Should they go home? Ernest Bevin issued this statement to the Polish forces: "Speaking on behalf of the British government, I declare that it is in the best interest of Poland that you should return to her now, as she requires the help of all her sons in the arduous task of reconstruction." Of course, had they returned, they could have been shot or sent to Siberia, as many were. 2. They could remain and find a local job, but they would have to work in factories like a brick factory. These were the only approved jobs to appease the British trade union, who were concerned that the new immigrants would be taking British men's jobs. Or 3, the British government offered education opportunities for those with the Polish resettlement corps once the government accepted they could not go back home. Polish refugees became one of the most prosperous immigrant groups in the UK after the war. However, there was still prejudice and racial tension towards the Poles. Finding work was challenging, as the input from the Poles during the war was quickly forgotten. Out of approximately 250,000 Polish soldiers in the West in 1945, a staggering 105,000 did actually return to Poland. However, those soldiers returning were quite literally committing suicide. Such was the difficult decision of that time. Meanwhile, what was happening in Lithuania? Unbeknown to Artur, his Polish family was expelled from their home and business and forced to migrate to their supposed country of origin. Although Artur's father was Lithuanian, his mother and brothers were deemed Polish. Out of 400,000 Lithuanians who identified as Polish, only 150,000 were finally able to leave and move to Poland, particularly to Gdansk. Gripped by panic and dread, the family took one of the last trains out, but sadly during the journey, his father became ill and had to get off the train in Belarus, where he later died due to poor health. His mother and 2 brothers continued to Poland. They went to Danzig, which had been a German city, now renamed as Gdansk. The Germans were retreating and the Russians were invading. There was bombings, killings, food shortages, and much more. After the war, Archie's mother desperately tried to find her son, to no avail. She felt certain if he had survived, he would return. Life was very grim. The death toll during World War II was indeed appalling. It is estimated that 70 to 85 million people died. That's 3% of the people on Earth in 58 countries. 50 to 56 million deaths caused by war. The rest was due to disease and famine. The countries with the highest death counts are recorded here. Of particular note, I'd like to highlight Poland, who lost 17% of their population, and Lithuania, a country that was neutral at the start of the war but sadly was invaded by Russia and Germany, lost 14% of their population. So, at the end of the war, Russia made claim to many countries. Arthur was now in the UK, his family was in Poland. How on earth could they find each other? The Red Cross turned out to be invaluable to many people trying to find their loved ones after the war. With a staggering 14 million inquiries received and just over 50% being resolved, this was amazing when you consider everything was paper-based with no computers. Today, the Red Cross still receive over 8,000 inquiries every year. Artur's mother had registered to find Artur in Lithuania and Poland, as she felt certain if he had survived, he would have returned. Luckily for her, after about 16 years, she decided to update the search and extend it to America, Canada, France, and the UK. Meanwhile, Artur was hunting for his family in Lithuania, and finally he added Poland at a later date. I digress for a moment to share with you the symptoms that many men returning from war experienced. Many suffered from PTSD or had breakdowns after the war. Prisoner of war trauma, survivor guilt rested heavy with many prisoners. Many turned to drink, drugs, and sadly overdose to cope. On this slide, I'm providing a quote from a British prisoner of war survivor, which I think gives you an idea of how challenging life was after the war for some. Back to Artur's story. Artur was now alone in the UK. Remember, he is still a very young man of 16 years old and decided to remain in the UK and secure an education to help him find meaningful work. He was a bright boy who could speak 5 languages, so learning English proved no challenge. He completed his high school studies and later studied for an economics degree in Scotland. At first, he was an English teacher to other immigrants and Polish soldiers. He briefly became a Russian translator for the BBC and then worked for Schweppes as an accountant. Due to war trauma and PTSD, one of his friends committed suicide, and he decided he would now study to be a psychologist in the hope he could be more helpful to his friends in the future. Artur and his friends, though, found it was very difficult applying for work and felt this was due to prejudice towards the Polish young men. They decided to change their name, and his friends chose Welsh names such as Talbot and Glyn on the basis that their accent might be mistaken for being Welsh. No doubt a mistake on Artur's side, but somehow he changed his family name to Arthur. But like magic, he finally was able to secure meaningful work. Artur did further study and finally earned a PhD in psychology, where he also met his future wife. In his new role as an assistant lecturer at the Maudsley Hospital in the UK, he had the opportunity to instruct an international range of graduate students in both the fields of psychology and psychiatry. In early 1962, he finally received a letter from the Red Cross informing him they had located his mother and brother in Poland. It had been 18 years since he was taken away, and now, at the age of 35 years old, he was determined to return and catch up. He decided to travel to Warsaw in Poland, not realizing the risk he was taking. On arrival, he was detained for 5 hours. As his wife later remembered, they were quite naive, but eventually his visit was approved. You can imagine the joy of this reunion. However, It was a bittersweet moment, as Artur had just accepted a new role as Associate Professor at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and later he was headhunted by Queen's University Canada to be the Director and Professor for their graduate program in clinical psychology. To conclude, Artur never met his mother again, but she died content knowing her youngest son had survived the war and was living happily in the West. He was able to keep his promise and met his brother one more time. Artur also remembered his pledge to help friends who suffered with stress during the war. One of the many papers he published was entitled "The Stress of Predictable and Unpredictable Shock" in 1986. This was a significant contribution to his theory of stress, and it became a classic in its fields. Like so many young Polish or Lithuanian men, he had an extraordinary and deeply traumatic experience at a very young age. Those that remained in Lithuania never spoke of the horrors they faced out of fear of being killed. I declare Artur was a survivor and a hero to some. He was an amazingly strong young man who experienced the devastating pain due to war, but worked hard to get educated, survive alone at such a young age, and in his profession help others by teaching a new generation of psychologists who in turn taught and helped others. As I mentioned, a fictionalized version of his family life is available on Amazon as a low-cost ebook or paperback, entitled "Against My Will, Lithuania to Freedom." At the back, there are classroom activities for students as well as suggested book club discussion questions. Thank you.